All right, so we talked about the beginning of the Korean War, in that right after World War II, Korea had already had a communist government set up by the Soviet Union, whereas the southern portion of Korea, on the bottom part of the 38th parallel, had a democratic government that practiced capitalism. Well, both sides tried to talk in order to reunite, but diplomatic talks broke down, and North Korea, in their communist government, invaded South Korea in 1950. And the Americans came to their aid, led by General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, the same one who promised "I shall return" in the Philippines. And there's a great picture here of the invasion. So in 1950, here's North Korea, South Korea, the 38th parallel, okay, that separated them. So you see that the North Korean forces invaded the 38th parallel in South Korea and began to march southeastward. And what's going to happen is that they are going to push all the way to this peninsula, this perimeter that's called the Pusan Perimeter, where the South Korean forces were backed into a corner. When General Douglas MacArthur leads the invasion of Korea to help South Korea, he launches a surprise attack. So they move against the communist forces here, pushing northward, but they also lead a naval amphibious attack here on Incheon, right here near Seoul. And this caught the North Koreans off guard, and they began to push them back across the 38th parallel. But General MacArthur was of the philosophy that there is no substitute for victory. And in fact, that's one of his famous phrases that he told President Truman. There is no substitute for victory, meaning it's all or nothing. And he didn't want to just push them back to their side of the 38th parallel. He wanted to destroy the communists into oblivion. And so he began marching across the 38th parallel and ended up pushing the North Korean Communist forces all the way back to the Yalu River, which separates North Korea and China. And so we see this here in October 1st. Now, by the way, look how fast this is taking place. August 1st, they're backed into a corner. In September, they launched the attack. And in October, they're marching full speed into North Korea. This is a very fast development for the United States and how successful they're being in Korea. But once they push them all the way back to the Yalu River, the Chinese Communist forces are waiting to help the North Koreans. This is where President Truman implements his Truman policy of containment. He said, our goal is to not start a war with China. He said, our goal is to just contain communism. Well, the Chinese forces, you can see here the communist defenses. The Chinese forces on October 26th began to push the Americans back and the South Koreans back across the 38th parallel, kind of going back to where things were, until finally we were able to stop here where everything began, the 38th parallel. So there was a lot of backwards and forwards stuff going on here between the communists and the American and South Koreans, between those two sides. MacArthur did not agree with President Truman in his philosophy of containment. In fact, MacArthur wanted to invade China. He wanted to fully invade China. He wanted to use nuclear weapons against China. He said, we can destroy the communist government and put Chiang Kai-shek back in power in China. But Truman, he did not want to use nuclear weapons at all costs. Well, MacArthur, disagreeing with Truman, starts to make his sentiments known. I want you to understand, President Truman is the commander-in-chief. He's MacArthur's boss. MacArthur begins talking with members of Congress about how he disagreed and is very open and straightforward with that he doesn't agree with Truman and he wants to move forward with how he wants to do things. Truman ends up firing MacArthur. MacArthur comes back to the United States And what's surprising is that even though he's just been fired, he is welcomed as a hero. I've posted a video on, if you look at your assignments, where you clicked on this video, there's several other YouTube videos, one giving an overall description of the Korean War, one detailing Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, I believe it is, and then the other, no, it wasn't the Iron Curtain, it was Truman deposing MacArthur, and then the other, MacArthur being welcomed into America even though he's been fired. Watch how the Americans treat him. It was the biggest celebration given to a general other than George Washington. He was treated like royalty when he was welcomed back to America. So watch that video. But MacArthur went on trial to the Senate to explain himself and his going behind Truman's back, but he was eventually deposed and stripped of his command. And so what we see here is that now there is an established zone called the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. And if we bring that up with this picture, so this area is where the ceasefire took place, and it was the Demilitarized Zone. Now, how did the war end? Dwight D. Eisenhower, yes, that General Dwight D. Eisenhower from World War II, he ran on a platform saying that he would go to Korea himself and construct peace, which he was elected, he went to North Korea, and he established this ceasefire. And so the 38th parallel, you need to know that. Okay, this is now a DMZ zone, Demilitarized Zone. And both sides are heavily fortified, and there are several hundred yards in between the two that separate Communist North Korea and Democratic South Korea. Let's see, I kind of got ahead of myself with explaining this. So going through it, the Soviet Union and China backed North Korea. Starting from the southern tip of Korea, UN troops quickly pushed North Korean troops all the way back to the Chinese-Korean border. We talked about that. Chinese troops invaded North Korea and drove the UN troops back to the South Korean border. Like I said, MacArthur wanted to launch an all-out assault against China. Truman refused. Publicly protested and he was fired. And then the ceasefire was signed in 1953. So you need to know that the Korean War started in 1950, ended in 1953, and the DMZ is located on the 38th parallel. And that brings us to the Red Scare. Now communism is viewed as the big enemy for America. Many Americans suspected that communists had infiltrated the U.S. government, and it made matters worse when Whittaker Chambers, a former communist spy, testified against Alger Hiss, a government official, for being a communist. Alger Hiss was an aide to the president himself. He was a presidential aide. That's how far up this communist spy chain went, all the way to the Oval Office. And Hiss was found guilty. In fact, you can read a book about this. It was written by Whittaker Chambers himself. It's called Witness. And it's like a real-life spy novel. Very interesting. I would encourage you to read it. You also have an incident with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were a couple in New York that were found guilty of giving atomic secrets to the Soviets, and they were executed for treason. Then, to make matters even more polarized, you have Joseph McCarthy, a Republican senator, who at a speech, he was at some women's conference and was giving a speech, and he basically held up this paper and said, I have here listed all the names of government officials, high-working government officials, that are communist spies. And people began to freak out, and rightfully so, because they believed there were communist spies in the government. And so McCarthy began to hold these trials in Congress in order to root out the communist spies. Now, his opponents labeled his tactics McCarthyism, which today, if you hear anyone on the news or anyone in politics say that's just McCarthyism at its finest, that's basically saying you're scared, so you lash out against something that the public hates in order to try to cause disruption. And that it's basically just blind rage and blind tactics of getting people fired. But here's the thing. While McCarthy may have stirred up more trouble than what he asked for or what he should have, he did do the right thing in bringing to light that there were communist spies in the government. And while his tactics were a little bit overdrawn, he was successful in rooting out several communist spies from our government. So McCarthy, I think he could have gone about some things a little bit better, but I think that what he did overall was the right thing. So people use McCarthyism as a negative term, but he was just trying to do what was right by his country. All right, so that's it for today. We're going to pick up with the Eisenhower and Kennedy eras tomorrow. You will have a quiz on Thursday. So your quiz will cover all of the information from the beginning of this chapter to where we stopped today. All right, so this is, you need to study all the way up to the Red Scare. I'll see you guys next time. Stay safe.